other threats. But will Mr. Trump be able to force Kim Jong-un to give up his nuclear weapons? Former NATO Supreme Allied Commander Wesley Clark addressed that this morning on Squawk Box.
The only person we've convinced to get rid of the nuclear capability was Muammar Gaddafi. Prime Minister Tony Blair, and look what happened. As soon as he got rid of it, 2 years later, we said, you know, we don't like that guy much anyway. That's a real lesson to Kim Jong-un. He can look at that and see, even if he was generous, what's the odds that 2 years, 3 years from now, someone wouldn't say, now that they don't have nuclear weapons, we didn't like him anyway.
Joining us now, Fred Kemp, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and Bruce Klingner, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Klingner and Fred, welcome. Fred, let me get your reaction to what General Clark just said there. Should Kim Jong-un rely on representations that we'd go easy on him, wouldn't have any problem with him if he just gave up his nukes?
Kim Jong-un, not only is General Clark right, but Kim Jong-un has actually told foreign visitors that Muammar Gaddafi is his warning sign. He doesn't want to go the way that he went. But if you actually take Donald Trump at his word, then his regime may be more endangered by not negotiating some sort of settlement than negotiating. If you look at the Fire and Fury statement, it really has echoes, chilling echoes of Harry Truman's statement in 1945 before attacking Hiroshima, where he said a rain of ruin would fall from the air on Japan if they didn't agree to the settlement that the U.S. was achieving that time. But as you said before, it's unclear to me whether this was an impulsive statement or this was an interagency statement that has some strategy and intent behind it.
Bruce, what do you think, especially when you listen to what General Clark said this morning? What incentives would North Korea ever have to come to the table? I mean, he really crystallized what is going through his mind and the struggles we face in trying to get him to negotiate.
All right. And North Korea will say both publicly and privately that they will point to U.S. attacks on not only Gaddafi but also Milosevic, Yugoslavia, and Saddam Hussein in Iraq. So they use that as justification for having nuclear weapons and having broken 8 international agreements they reached before, to promising never to build them or to give them up once they had built them. So with the idea, though, of pressure tactics is to try to alter their calculus on that, seeing that as they get increasingly isolated from the U.S. and the international financial system, while leaving open the door for negotiations. But we've gone down the negotiations path, and it hasn't gone well.
It sounds like both of you, Fred, are saying fundamentally the same thing, that the negotiating path makes no sense based on our history, the United States history, makes no sense for Kim Jong-un.
Well, it makes no sense for Kim Jong-un, but we have to make it make sense to him. But the key in this, and this is what we can't forget, particularly for your viewers, because what's really going to move markets is how do things go with the U.S.-Chinese relationship. This is the most important bilateral relationship of this generation. And this is a catalytic moment for that relationship. If we manage this well, and so far we've managed North Korea okay with China, then that could actually set the terms for a new way of corresponding with them and cooperating with them on the world stage. And if we don't, that could make for a long period of confrontation to come, and that could have a heavy impact on the world economy and obviously security as well.
Bruce, I asked Fred this question the other day, so I'm not going to ask him today, but I will ask you. The more statement you react. Prediction: North Korea is going to have nuclear weapons and the world is going to live with it.
Well, I think we're going to live with it in the short term, but we need to try to alter that and continue to have denuclearization as our policy. On negotiations, as I said, we've had 8 international agreements with North Korea, and all of them failed because North Korea broke all of them. We've had 2-party, 3-party, 4-party, 6-party talks, et cetera.
So if negotiations have failed, then I jump to the conclusion, then what? Do we have to bomb them? Somebody's got to bomb them? There's got to be regime change? What do we do?
No, what I would say is that you don't have premature negotiations, and I'm against a preventative attack. I think that would precipitate perhaps an all-out war on the peninsula. There's much more we can do on the pressure side. It's simply wrong when President Obama and others say North Korea is the most heavily sanctioned, the most cut-off nation on earth. There's more we can do on that. We've been pulling our punches on a number of issues, and so I think we continue that on that
So be
path
specific there. Be specific there, and doesn't that depend on China being and the Soviets, the Russians? I show my age there, and the Russians being willing to enforce and go along with whatever sanctions are promulgated.
Right. What we need to do is divorce law enforcement from diplomacy. We continue to try to get China to fulfill required UN sanctions. We know they're turning a blind eye to proliferation and illicit activities benefiting North Korea on their soil. But the U.S. can do things with its own law. We know the vast majority of all international financial transactions in the world, including North Korea's and China's, are denominated in dollars, which means they have to go through U.S. banks. The U.S. imposed $12 billion in fines on European banks for money laundering for Iran. We haven't imposed a single penny in fines on Chinese banks. Last year was the first year the U.S. had cumulatively sanctioned as many North Korean entities as we had sanctioned those of Zimbabwe. So a couple weeks ago, the Trump administration sanctioned the Bank of Dandong, one Chinese bank. That was the first Chinese bank in 12 years that the U.S. had taken action against for violating U.S. law. So we're in essence giving de facto immunity from U.S. law to Chinese entities that are working to facilitate North Korea's nuclear and missile program. So we can use U.S. law to wean away those entities from dealing with North Korea.
A very important relationship, as you've highlighted, Fred, between the United States and China. You mentioned earlier, for our audience, this could be a catalytic moment for the U.S.-China relationship. You just heard what Bruce said. What is the takeaway, you think, most importantly for our audience when it comes to this North Korea situation?
Well, I couldn't agree more that the unilateral financial sanctions are what could do the most to push this another notch up. Don't forget, we did get the Chinese and the Russians to sign on to a 15-0 vote at the Security Council to ramp up sanctions more. $1 billion of North Korea's $3 billion of exports will be affected by that, but that comes nowhere near the hurt that would come from the financial sanctions. And then from the Chinese and the Iranians perhaps, but the Chinese more likely, oil sanctions, the export of oil to North Korea. So there's a way to really screw the screws much tighter on North Korea. And then the people around Kim Jong-un have to start asking themselves, is this really smart for us? Is his course saber-rattling and building a nuclear weapons system that threatens the United States the way that we're going to save North Korea or not? And I think that what I worry about with the ramping up of rhetoric on Trump's part is he's starting to draw a red line he's not yet ready to enforce, and we should be screwing the screws a little bit tighter on the financial and economic side before we start talking about war.
Yeah, using other options instead. All right, thank you, Fred. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a news alert in the bond market right now. 10-year notes up for auction. Rick Santelli's tracking the action. Rick.